the 6th of October, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Israel's border troops, below strength during the holiday, came under surprise attack by Syrian and Egyptian forces 10 times greater than their own. This time they learnt to respect the courage and fighting abilities of the Arab armies. In particular, the Egyptians, who fought their way across the Suez Canal with spectacular success, and then engaged them in the biggest and bitterest tank battles since the Second World War. It was a war in which the latest military technology overturned conventional tactics. It transformed the theories of modern warfare. High-tech Soviet missile systems challenged the now established superiority of the Israeli Air Force, hindering their attempts to carry out ground support roles in the first hours of the war. And on the ground, the apparently invincible Israeli armor came up against a new generation of anti-tank missiles. They were operated by highly trained Arab infantry who bore no resemblance to the soldiers routed in '56 and '67. The question all Israelis asked that day was, why were they so ill prepared? The answer lay in the stunning Israeli victory of 1967. The key factor had been those first 3 hours of the 5th of June, in which the Israeli Air Force virtually wiped out the combined Arab air forces. The impact of total air supremacy had transformed the course of the war on the ground. Most Israeli military thinking since had been based on the belief that the Arabs would never again risk a major attack without being able to compete in the air. They believed it would be 1975 before Arab air power was strong enough to contemplate another war. However, the sheer scale of the Arab defeat put tremendous domestic pressure on the Arab leaders to try again. Syria's Golan Heights, the West Bank of Jordan, and the entire Egyptian Sinai Peninsula were a constant reminder of the humiliation of 1967. King Hussein, having lost half of Jordan to the Israelis, could not afford another direct clash. But for the new presidents now in power in both Damascus and Cairo, it was a risk they felt compelled to take. Israel still had less than half the number of men, tanks and planes, and a fraction of the missiles that Egypt and Syria could field against them. Those forces would have to cover two fronts, a further handicap for Israel. At the end of the '67 war, the Egyptians had been driven out of Sinai and had concentrated on defending the West Bank of the Suez Canal. The Israelis knew from experience that the key to the desert lay in the passes that crossed through a mountainous ridge beyond their headquarters at Bir Gifgafa. They constructed a defensive line along the east bank of the canal named after General Bar-Lev, and a series of forts were built along it. Tanks would move to prepared positions between them during an alarm. To counter Israeli air raids during the War of Attrition, the Egyptians built up one of the world's densest missile walls, creating an anti-aircraft umbrella over the whole Suez area. President Sadat realized that even without a comparable air force, he could fight a limited war under that umbrella, cross the canal, gain a foothold in Sinai, and then negotiate with Russian help. He shared his plan with Syria's President Assad, who also obtained Soviet SAM missiles to cover the Golan battlefield. They agreed a timetable for a coordinated attack when Israel would be least prepared. General Ahmed Ismail, the Egyptian war minister, was appointed to overall command of both the Syrian and Egyptian forces. He negotiated with the Russians for the military hardware they would need. He shared the planning with his chief of staff, General Saad el-Shazli, a popular hero figure who had led paratroops in Sinai in '67 and was one of the few Egyptian officers to emerge with credit. He rid the Egyptian officer corps of its Cairo playboy image and instigated rigorous training. His preparations omitted nothing. He even studied old records of the Suez Canal Company to check tidal conditions. In the middle of the war, he opposed Sadat over the role of the Armoured Reserve at a crucial point and was quietly dismissed. On the Israeli side, the defense minister Moshe Dayan was a powerful personality who had dominated Israeli military affairs for years. His courage and flair were amply demonstrated during the Sinai campaign of 1956. But this time he failed to live up to expectation. From the start, he was torn by doubt and unwilling to take responsibility for vital military decisions. He was heavily criticized for Israel's lack of preparation after the war. General Dayan described the Suez Canal as the best anti-tank ditch in the world. He calculated it would take 24 hours to bridge it and cut through the sandbanks the Israelis had built all along the canal, up to 60 feet high in places. Ample time, he thought, for the forts along the Bar-Lev line to be supported by the Armour Reserve, waiting further back in Sinai. The 600 men manning the Bar-Lev forts had grown complacent too. Egyptian exercises had been a regular event for months, and even fresh construction work was thought to be an attempt to stave off boredom. But like the exercises, it was just one part of the meticulous planning that would make the canal crossing an epic military achievement. In October, the Bar-Lev forts were manned by reservists of the Jerusalem Brigade, doing their annual military service. They found out what the construction work was for at 2 p.m. on the 6th. Tank ramps now overlooked their positions. The tanks joined 1,000 other guns, pouring tons of high explosive onto the Bar-Lev line, while an airstrike hit Israeli positions deep in Sinai. It was the start of a technically brilliant operation that would restore Arab military credibility. The Egyptians were so proud of it that months later, their Third Army reenacted the whole exercise for the cameras. Hundreds of machines wreathed the West Bank and the canal in smoke. Screened from Israeli eyes, 8,000 Egyptian infantry began crossing the canal in rubber dinghies at midpoints between the forts. In 1971, the Israelis had tested a method of pouring oil onto the canal from an underground system and turning it into a wall of flame. The Egyptians took no chances. The night before, frogmen had blocked pipes leading down to the canal. Once the first wave had scaled the bank and established a foothold, tank hunting units moved inland to await the first Israeli armor, equipped with RPG-7 anti-tank weapons, and the latest Soviet anti-tank missile, the Saga. Unfolded from a suitcase, it could be set up in minutes. Its wire guidance system and 3,000-yard range demanded courage and skill from the operators. Each had fired 100 rockets during training. It wrought havoc among the Israeli tanks. One unit alone claimed 8 tanks in the first 10 minutes. With the tank defense now in place and heavier equipment arriving, the second phase of the operation could begin. Designated teams began clearing the Israeli defenses, where the Jerusalem Brigade, after the initial shock, were now fighting back. Further south on the Bitter Lakes, an amphibious operation was underway. Tanks and troop carriers of the Third Army poured more men into the Sinai. In imitation of Israeli tactics, heli-borne troops had been dropped behind the lines. The 130th Marine Brigade had orders to join them in the desert. It was the only failure of the whole operation. The Israelis shot down 14 loaded helicopters, and the survivors achieved little. The Egyptian generals had estimated they would lose 10,000 men in crossing the canal alone. In fact, the barrage kept most Israelis in their bunkers. And throughout this most dangerous and exposed phase of the operation, only 208 men were lost. The problem of how to cut through the sandbanks was solved by an ingenious Egyptian lieutenant who had worked on the construction of the Aswan Dam. British irrigation pumps powered high-pressure hoses which simply washed the sand into the canal. Using this technique, they cut the holes in half the time it would have taken with either explosives or bulldozers. And during the first day, they cut 60 of them. Cutting the gaps was a feat of Egyptian ingenuity, but bridging the canal was achieved through well-tried Soviet expertise and equipment. PMP bridges designed to cross European rivers were put into use for the first time under wartime conditions. The sectional pontoons could be joined to others in minutes. On the day, the Israeli garrison said they grew across the river, like outstretched arms. Another Soviet crossing system was even quicker. The GSP ferry was formed by two amphibious lorries which linked together in the water and would then expand hydraulically, creating a platform that could carry a tank across the canal in a matter of minutes. Every aspect of the crossing operation had been thoroughly rehearsed and planned in minute detail by General Shazli's staff, with two goals in mind: surprise and speed. The whole Israeli defensive system in Sinai turned on the assumption that it would take 48 hours to get armoured divisions and heavy equipment across. They were convinced they could foil any attack in that time. In 10 hours, the Egyptians had already got 10 bridges set up and 500 tanks positioned on the east bank. Inside 24 hours, 2 infantry and 2 armoured divisions had crossed the canal. It was the high point of the war for Egypt. Within 30 minutes of the start of the war, the Israeli armoured reserve drove forward into the line according to plan, unaware of the reception that awaited them. They were decimated by the Egyptian tank hunting squads. Air power was inevitably Israel's next response, flying into the teeth of the missile umbrella to stop the crossings, rather than concentrating on the missile sites first, as they'd known they should. Plans for a preemptive strike that morning had been ruled out by American pressure. Israel would get no support if it was seen as the aggressor, as Moshe Dayan had to explain to a bemused nation.
In this case, we considered it, and it was the decision of the government not to strike first, even though we were sure that they will do that, in order to have that political, or whatever you call it, advantage at the expenses of the military disadvantage.
And that disadvantage was now becoming clearer as the Egyptians consolidated their hold on the east bank. If they survived the missiles, the Air Force still had to locate the bridges hidden beneath smoke screens. Even when hit, their sectional construction made them easy to repair, and they could be floated to new crossing points with relative ease. Egyptian troops rejoiced in their achievement. They had destroyed the first counterattacks exactly according to plan, and now one by one, they were taking possession of the forts along the Bar-Lev line. Not all fell easily, though. The northernmost fort was never taken. And in the south, opposite Port Tewfik, 1 officer and 42 men held out for a week before surrendering through the Red Cross. After repeated attacks, they were down to their last few grenades and bullets. The Egyptian officer who took over the fort believed they'd hidden their heavy weapons. The truth was, they had none. They were ferried across to Port Tewfik, where the survivors helped their wounded comrades ashore and into captivity. Among the Israeli reserves pouring down the road into Sinai on Monday the 8th, morale was still high. Their confidence in another easy victory was reinforced by their route through the Mitla Pass, still strewn with the wreckage of Egyptian defeats in 1956 and 67. But that mood was soon replaced by a much grimmer one, as the reality of the situation and the extent of their early losses became apparent. In those first few days in Sinai, only the Egyptians had cause to celebrate. The Sinai front was 125 miles from the main Israeli cities, but in the north there was no margin for error. The Golan Heights were barely 17 miles across, and from this plateau littered with volcanic rock, 4 routes led down across the Jordan into northern Israel. The Benot Yaakov Bridge bore the most important, leading from Quneitra and the area HQ at Kfar Nafak. A key Israeli observation point on Mount Hermon was known as the Eyes of Israel, as it overlooked the entire region. The Syrian plan was to cross the ceasefire line in one massive armoured assault, 2 columns forming a pincer to take Kfar Nafak and the bridge, while others struck out for minor routes. At 1400, synchronised with the Egyptian attack, a 50-minute artillery barrage began. It paved the way for the Syrian armour, which then swept past the border posts. They flowed in like water, one Israeli said. I never knew there were so many tanks in all the world. The Israelis had 180 tanks and 60 guns with which to hold the 40-mile front. It was the most desperate and heroic struggle of the war. A young lieutenant with a handful of tanks held up the main Syrian thrust for 20 hours at one point, ambushing, switching position, and attacking again. Mobile artillery proved effective in slowing the advance too, and it was well employed. For the sole Israeli advantage was in knowing the ground. They'd practiced over it numerous times, measuring the ranges and the best angles of fire. But they hadn't anticipated odds of 5 to 1, or at times 11 to 1, and remorselessly they were forced back. As in Sinai, the Israeli Air Force was thrown in to slow the advance. But even at low level, running the gauntlet of the SAM batteries proved costly. They lost 40 planes in the first afternoon. Infantry-operated SAM-7s and anti-aircraft guns joined the white contails of the SAM-6s, crisscrossing the sky to deadly effect. They adapted their tactics quickly, though, flying in low over Jordan to take the Syrians in the flank, avoiding many of the batteries. Wrecked Syrian vehicles lining the route bore witness to their effectiveness. And in places, the burnt and blackened ground showed that, like the Americans in Vietnam, they were using napalm. On Sunday, Israeli reserves in modified World War II Sherman tanks were deployed in the southern sector. They were opposing T-55s and even T-62s, the Russians' latest tank. Despite the 30-year technological gap, they destroyed greater numbers of Syrians. But at a cost. The 2 Israeli frontline brigades were virtually wiped out. They had, however, bought time for the citizen army. Mobilization had begun on Saturday. Many didn't wait for their code words. Seizing their equipment, they headed to either front, pressing lorries, cars and buses into service. One platoon even drove a milk float to their base in Sinai. Prime Minister Golda Meir expressed their mood.
This people, small as it is, surrounded as it is by enemies, has decided to live. And if we have to pay the price for living, we have to pay it. This is not a people that can give in.
Arriving piecemeal, the first reinforcements in the Golan were sent straight to the front. The situation was so desperate, there was no time for a coordinated response. In the south, the Syrians were now only 10 minutes tank drive from the Benot Yaakov bridge. By Monday morning, though, 36 hours into the war, the roads to the Golan were jammed with troops and equipment, in civilian as well as military lorries. Approaching the heights, they had to risk artillery fire directed from Mount Hermon, which had fallen to Syrian commandos in the first hours of the war. Fully mobilized, the Israeli army began to turn the tide. Casualties had been heavy. They lost 250 men in the first 2 days in the Golan. It was not a price a small army could keep paying. And from Monday, limiting casualties became a priority. They now relied more heavily on artillery to dislodge the Syrians at long range. Yet Israel's part-time soldiers sounded confident.
I think that we already are going to finish the war. They got the nice kick down, and we hope to be at the weekend at home.
It would not prove that easy. Syrian resistance remained stubborn in retreat, despite their staggering losses. The advancing Israelis counted 500 tanks among the wrecks strewn across the heights. North of Quneitra, the Syrian columns had been constricted by minefields, and the crack Israeli 7th Armoured Division hadn't wasted that advantage. They called the area the Valley of Tears. Abandoned among the wrecks were brand new Soviet Saga carriers, capable of firing 6 of these latest missiles. Israeli mechanized infantry cleared out pockets of resistance bypassed by the advancing armor. And by Wednesday the 10th, the Israeli Chief of Staff, General Elazar, could report on Israeli progress.
I am glad to tell you that we managed to push almost all of the Syrian forces to the ceasefire line.
But they were not stopping there.
We continue our counterattack. We shall continue it tomorrow, and we shall break and destroy completely all the attacking forces.
The Israelis had cleared most of the Golan, but they could not switch to Sinai until the Syrian threat was destroyed. So they attacked again in the northern sector, using Mount Hermon as cover for their left flank. They crossed the ceasefire line into Syria on the 11th, taking the shortest route towards Damascus. 2 days later, they were 15 miles beyond the ceasefire line, only 25 miles from Damascus itself. The Syrian reserves put up strong opposition from prepared defenses, and the Israelis had a hard slog all the way. With his capital threatened by Israeli artillery, President Assad appealed for an Egyptian attack in Sinai to relieve the pressure. Syrian MiGs joined the desperate defense, swooping on the columns on the left flank near Mount Hermon. But it was a rare appearance, for in the air, the Israelis were once more in control. The MiGs couldn't match them in aerial combat. And having destroyed the bulk of the Syrian missile system, they were now attacking targets all over Syria, disrupting the Soviet airlift of military supplies. At C2, they were choking the supply route. In the first ever naval missile battle, they virtually wiped out the Syrian Navy. And the Soviet Union was forced to move its own fleet to keep Syrian ports open. The Americans responded by reinforcing their 6th Fleet, a thinly veiled warning against further Soviet involvement. The Arab world too came to Syria's aid.
The Jordanian forces entered Syria and have been heavily engaged in action throughout yesterday.
4,000 men of the Jordanian 40th Brigade fought alongside an Iraqi armoured division, attacking the southern flank. But coordination between them proved difficult. Both suffered heavily at the hands of the Israelis. They were the last major armoured battles on the Golan front. The Israeli advance continued along the Damascus road until it ran up against the main Syrian defence line around Sassa. Now within artillery range of southern Damascus, the Israelis were content to hold their ground, switching forces to the Sinai front. In Sinai, by the 13th of October, the Egyptians had 3 bridgeheads on the eastern bank, which they'd extended sideways along most of the canal, but which were only 10 miles deep. Yet the Egyptians were confident. They'd achieved most of their aims and were well dug in behind an anti-tank and anti-aircraft missile screen. All around them lay evidence of the damage they'd inflicted on the Israeli counterattacks. All they had to do was wait for the ceasefire according to plan. But Sadat had changed his mind. On his express orders, the two armoured divisions which formed the main reserve on the West Bank began crossing to the east, responding to appeals for action by President Assad. After the war, General Shazli claimed that for 2 days he had argued against this move, fearing that it left no protection on the West Bank. But finally, Sadat had given him a direct order, and he obeyed. The two fresh divisions were to lead a wide pincer movement to take Bir Gifgafa, forcing the Israelis to concentrate on their southern front. The Israelis were ready for them. It was what they'd hoped for. Tanks and infantry lay in wait, the latter now equipped with American TOW missiles. The further the Egyptians came beyond their anti-aircraft shield, the more damage they would suffer at the hands of the Israelis. At 6 a.m. on the 14th of October, the biggest tank battle since Kursk in World War II began. 2,000 tanks locked in combat along a 100-mile front. By nightfall, the Egyptians had lost a total of 264 tanks. The Israelis, only 10. Superior Israeli tactics account for part of that disparity, but another surprisingly simple reason was the suitability of the tanks to the desert terrain. When emerging from the hull-down position behind dunes, the main Israeli tank, the Centurion, could depress its barrel by 10 degrees, presenting a small target in order to fire. The lower-profile Soviet T-55 used by the Egyptians could only depress its barrel by 4 degrees and presented a much larger target in order to bring its gun to bear. It was not only the Egyptian armour that suffered. Once more they dropped paratroopers into and behind the lines, and once more the Israelis rounded them up. Despite that resounding defeat, President Sadat's drive to address the Egyptian People's Assembly on the 16th was akin to a Roman triumphal march. He and General Ismail were mobbed as they entered the assembly. They had given the Egyptian people a tremendous victory, restoring their national pride. In his address, President Sadat described the crossing of the canal as a miracle by any military standard, and went on to say the nation could feel safe and secure. It was now armed with a sword and a shield. But even as he spoke, a column of Israeli tanks was busy demolishing Egypt's shield. Not in Sinai, but in Africa. The Israelis had crossed the canal, and with no reserves to stop them, they were rampaging deep behind the Egyptian lines. Having identified the weak point where the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies met north of the Bitter Lakes, the Israelis had launched a counterattack on the 15th under General Sharon, forcing a passage through the Egyptian bridgehead and across the canal, where it began destroying the missile sites. It had been a risky affair. The hardest battle had been on the eastern bank near Chinese Farm, as paratroopers, armour and artillery fought for 2 days to stop the Egyptians from closing the gap behind the task force. Once across the canal, they'd found the ground undefended. The Egyptian armour was on the wrong bank. They moved freely over the Sweetwater Canal and began combined attacks on the missile batteries. Tanks covering the paratroopers as they swept through the bunkers. General Shazli was now at breaking point. He argued for the transfer of armour to the west, but Sadat dismissed the Israeli crossing as a mere television operation and secretly relieved Shazli of his command. It was the American airlift of military equipment to Israel that finally convinced Sadat of the gravity of his position. Material losses had been enormous on both sides, but he had expected the Israelis to grind to a halt long before his own Soviet supplies ran dry. Now he was forced to ask the Russians to arrange a ceasefire. Moshe Dayan had been against the crossing from the start, but had refused to make a decision either way. He told Elazar that he must decide on military grounds alone. But when they met in Sinai on the 19th, both knew that they now had everything to play for.
How is your task force doing on the other side of the canal?
Oh, well, that's one of the, how do you say, 64,000 questions.
How about the American equipment? Has any of that come into action yet?
Why should I say? Yes or no? What's good for our relationship? Anyway, we are very happy.
We are creating the necessary conditions to open our major offensive.
The Israelis now had 2 bridges across the canal, and their presence on the West Bank was growing stronger by the hour. They now tightened their grip on the towns and villages within an area of 1,200 square kilometers. The front line continued to expand, taking out more missile sites, punching a wider hole in the anti-aircraft umbrella, which allowed Israeli planes to threaten the Second Army positions further north. Belatedly, Egyptian resistance was growing, both on the ground and in the air. This air attack on the 22nd of October ended minutes before the announcement of a ceasefire. The evident delight of these soldiers was not shared by all Israelis.
No, I don't agree, because the Egyptians think that they succeeded in this war. They think that if they have placed some few hundreds of soldiers and tanks in our bank of the canal, then they think that this is a victory for them. And when the Arabs think that they have won or they have a big victory, this encourages them. And the next thing you'll know is that in a year or two, we'll have another war and more casualties.
But within hours, the ceasefire broke down. The Israelis seized their chance, dashing forwards to the outskirts of Port Suez. By the 24th, they had cut the Suez to Cairo road at kilometre 101 and were only 60 miles from the Egyptian capital itself. The Battle of the Ceasefire transformed the situation. The Israeli drive had now trapped the Egyptian Third Army in Sinai, cutting all its supply lines. They now held a tremendous bargaining counter in the south. In the north, the elite Golani Brigade fought a bitter battle to recapture Mount Hermon, losing 70 men. 8 hours before the ceasefire on the 22nd, their pennant was raised alongside the Israeli flag on the summit. Now the Israeli flag flew in Africa too. As the second ceasefire came into effect, the 2 armies watched each other warily across the canal from reversed positions. This time, United Nations troops had been sent to enforce it and to arrange the passage of supplies through Israeli checkpoints. It was a remarkable turnaround. The initial Egyptian triumph had been cut from under them. A whole army was now dependent on Israeli goodwill in order to survive. Each side had lost territory to the other, but with the missile shield torn open and 20,000 Egyptians captive in the desert, the Israelis now held the upper hand. At kilometre 101 on the Cairo road, for the first time ever, an Egyptian delegation arrived to negotiate directly with representatives of a country whose existence it did not even recognize. No one there would have believed that such a dialogue could continue, or that within 4 years, President Sadat would stand to address the Israeli parliament. At the heart of the country, he had fought so hard to destroy.